Oh, what I wouldn't give for a burning bush. I would even settle for one smoldering tumbleweed if only it came with the voice of God. I just want a sign, a clear sign, a tangible, visible, unmistakable sign that would help me know what to do. I've wished for a sign. I've prayed for a sign when I've been faced with major decisions in my life, where to go to college or whether or not I should marry Olivia. Now, let me hasten to say, I've been married for 35 and a quarter years, and I still am madly in love with her, as I was madly in love with her then. But I remember at the time worrying, wrestling, wondering, because how could I know for sure that she was the right person or that I was the right person for her? How could I know for sure? If only God had set burning letters in a hedge that said, "Go ahead and marry her, you fool." Or when it came to graduate school, whether to go to seminary, where to go to divinity school, whether to go work on a PhD, where to do that. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that God would make it crystal clear, that He would give me a sign. And let's not forget the call to ministry. The call to ministry. I first felt some stirrings of a call when I was 12 years old. In my 12-year-old wisdom, I said that God had given me a big mouth, and He must want me to use it for His glory. But as time passed, I wasn't sure what that looked like. I wasn't sure whether I had really heard that correctly. I wasn't sure where to go or what to do. I remember whenever I was 22 and I looked back and I thought, was I just trying to follow my parents' footsteps? Both of them were in ministry. Or was I really called? And if I was called, to what? I had no idea. Oh, for a sign. Time and time again, you and I have faced major life-changing decisions. And if you're anything like me, you long for a clear sign from God, because it feels like if we make the wrong decision, if we miss the turn, if we go the wrong direction, it's all over. Have you felt that way? That you're going to make a misstep, and if you do, well, you might as well just stop right there. Now, it's a topic for another sermon, whether or not God's will is so easily frustrated. We could talk about Moses and all the ways that he took missteps and whether or not God was able to redeem that. That's a topic for another day, but the fact remains that when it comes to the major decisions, it would be so nice to have a nice, clear, unmistakable burning bush. And not just when it comes to the major decisions of life. What about a nice, clear sign even in the day-to-day? I don't know about you, but I kind of get tired of having to be nice all the time. I mean, the Bible is full of all these irritating things that it says, repay evil with good and never take vengeance, and keep on extending hospitality to strangers, and feed our enemies, love our enemies, and meet the needs of others, and take the extra mile, and turn the other cheek, and be patient in suffering, and blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. And I think to myself, isn't there supposed to be a time when there's a limit to all this niceness? Isn't there a place where we're supposed to cut people loose? Surely there's some point at which we are supposed to disfellowship those who only seek to take advantage of us. I seem to remember Jesus talking about shaking the dust off of one's feet. How do I know when to do that? How do I know when it is time to move from niceness to moving on? And part of the problem is that one of the things that might seem like a sign is exactly what we heard about in Matthew today: suffering. Suffering. When it comes to suffering, we find ourselves at a place of puzzlement, because does suffering mean that we've done something wrong, or does it mean that we're taking up the cross as Jesus commanded? I don't know about you, but whenever I go to the doctor and I say to the doctor, "Doctor, I've got this pain whenever I do this," and he says, "Don't do this." So whenever I'm in a ministry experience and I find that I'm dealing with struggles and people are being not very nice and they're taking advantage of me and they're chewing me up and they're spitting me out and the people are a pain in the posterior, surely it's a sign that it's time to shake the dust off, isn't it? But Matthew 16 tells us to take up the cross. The Bible tells us to be ready to suffer. Romans 12 says, be patient in suffering. 1 Peter tells us that if we suffer for doing right, we have God's approval. James tells us to count it all joy when we suffer various trials. And Hebrews tells us to endure suffering for the sake of discipline. And it goes on and it goes on. How do we know? How do we know when something we experience is a sign that we should make this decision or make that decision? It can be so hard as a minister. We sometimes think our call is in question because we have endured suffering at the hands of those with whom we minister. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Any place of ministry, whether the church or anything else, ministry can be one of the most wonderful, fulfilling, loving places that we will ever experience. And it can also be one of the nastiest, most vicious, and most pitiless places that we could ever be. It turns out that the greatest blessing and the greatest curse of any ministry is that it's full of people. So when we are suffering, is that a sign that we should cut and run? Is that a sign that we should get out of there? Are we in danger of leaving too quickly? Oh no, how do I know? God, am I supposed to leave this situation because the people are not responding? The conflicts have erupted. The deacons are mad. The hurtful things have been said. Should I leave? Or should I stay? But then am I in danger of staying too long? Do I have a false martyr complex where I'm saying, I'm suffering. Aren't I a good minister? Look at how good a minister I am. I'm suffering more than you are. Are we in danger of misreading what we're experiencing? It seems like over and over again we struggle. Now, there are times when I'm sure we miss that sign. And let me just suggest that when we have endured the 5th major conflict this week, and we have just been fired from the 15th place of ministry, maybe we ought to stop and ask, are we doing something wrong? But even then, it's possible, isn't it? It's possible that God has called us to take up the cross. It's possible that God wants us to do a little bit more suffering, not because He enjoys suffering, but because we need to be in a place that's difficult to do His work in that place. So how do we know? How do we know which one it is? How do we know whether we're in the right place at the right time? How do we know whether we're supposed to carry the cross or shake off the dust? Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be so helpful if only we could have a nice, clear sign? Oh, what I wouldn't give for a burning bush. If we just had a burning bush and a voice from God, all of our questions, all of our uncertainties, all of our hesitations would be resolved. If only we had a nice, clear sign like Moses got. We could be just like Moses, confidently moving forward to accept and live out the calling of God on our lives, never asking a question, never doubting God. Come on now, have you read the story? If you've read the story, you know that Moses, now let's just go through it. Moses had a burning bush, voice from God, staff that turned into a snake, water that turned into blood, a hand that could change from leprous to clean and back again, and more, and yet Moses still doubted. Moses still hesitated, not just here at the very beginning when he first heard God's voice, but again and again and again, all through his ministry. He questioned God. He wasn't sure if he was hearing the voice of God. Maybe it was just a bad case of indigestion. How do we know if Moses, with a burning bush and a voice from God and a staff that could turn into a snake and all the rest of it, if Moses didn't know, then maybe signs aren't quite what we think they are. Maybe signs aren't quite what we think they are. I want to suggest something that maybe we ought to conclude from Moses' experience, and not just Moses' experience, but all through the Bible, the experience of so many people who had what to us looks like an unmistakable sign from God. It looks so clear to us when we read the account, but they doubted and they hesitated and they struggled to know, and sometimes they took wrong turns. And if that's true for them, then I wonder if we ought to conclude that God never sends us a sign so clear that faith isn't required. Let me say that again. This is something that I think I can affirm in my own experience, that it rings true to what I have experienced throughout my life. There have been times, let me say, there have been times when I felt like God gave me a crystal ball. Not a voice from heaven, no, not that clear, and not a burning bush, but there were 2 times in my life when it felt like God spoke with absolute clarity. I knew exactly what I was supposed to do, or at least I did until some friends came along and started, asking me questions about it. But I felt like I had gotten this clear sign from God twice in my life. But most of the time. And even with those that seemed like they were clear, my experience has been that God never sends a sign so clear that faith isn't required. Every time that God sends a sign, people have to respond by faith and not by sight. Not by certainty. Oh, wouldn't it have made things easier if God had just made things certain? If God had just made things unmistakable? It occurs to me that God could have made the whole Exodus experience a whole lot easier. He could have made it so much easier on Moses, and he could have made it so much easier on the people. He could have saved them from all those years of wandering to and fro in the wilderness. He could have made it easier on himself. I mean, surely he had to get tired of their complaining and their whining and their rebellion. God could have made it easier. He could have simply pulled a Star Trek, beamed them up directly from Egypt to the promised land. Do you doubt that God could do that? God can do anything. God could have made it easier on them. Why didn't he? Why didn't he do the thing that would have been so much easier, so much more expeditious, so much more certain to achieve his will? It's clear, don't we think it's clear? God intended for them to make it to the promised land, to be planted there, to live there. He could have done it so much easier. But if he beamed them up, Scotty, no faith would have been required. If I'm honest, that's exactly what I wish God would do for me. When I ask God for a sign, if I'm really honest, what I'm really asking is that God would do something that would bypass faith. Send me a sign so clear that I have no choice but to believe. Send me something that will make this next step so clear that I can't possibly take a misstep. Give me something that will let me walk by certainty rather than by faith. I wish God would make it so clear that I could blame him if anything goes wrong. I wish that he would make it so clear that, in fact, that I could do without him altogether, because I would already know where to go and what the right step is and where to go and how to get there. And I would already know everything I need, and I would not need to even talk to him because I would already know. Oh my goodness. If I'm honest, what I really want is for God to bypass faith and let me have certainty. But God doesn't operate that way. At least not in my experience. What about in your experience? Has God ever sent you a sign so clear that faith was not required? I believe God never sends a sign so clear that faith is not required, with one little qualification. One little qualification, because it occurs to me that there is one sign that God gave Moses that was absolutely clear. One sign that God gave Moses. In fact, if we really pay attention to the text, it's the only thing that is described as a sign for Moses. It wasn't the burning bush. That's never described as a sign. That's just there to get Moses' attention. It's not the hissing snake or the leprous hand. That was a sign for the people. It wasn't turning water into blood or bringing up flies or frogs or any of those things. Those were signs for Moses. One thing is named as a sign for Moses, something that Moses would absolutely know that he was following God's will. Would you like to know what that one sign was? We heard it read a minute ago. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign." Oh, here it comes. Ready? This shall be the sign. When you get back, you'll worship me on this mountain. Did you catch how that works? After you're done, when you get back, after you've brought the people out of Egypt, after you look back on what has happened, then you will worship me. I have to say, that's very much my experience. And maybe it's your experience. So often Along the way, the signs have been murky. My understanding of what to do has been unclear. I have taken steps with hesitation and fear, but I've taken a step in faith as best I know how. And then I look back. And 35 and a quarter years later, I'm pretty sure I made the right choice to marry Olivia. And 26 years later, I'm pretty sure I made the right choice to come to Campbell. And on we could go. So often the clearest sign that I ever experience is the one that occurs in retrospect. At the time, I walked by faith. But in hindsight, in retrospect, I look back, and even though there may be some wandering in the wilderness along the way, I look back and I see that God has been with me, and I worship Him. That is the clearest sign we ever get that the great I Am is with us. The ever-present I Am has been nudging us and pulling us and poking us and pushing us onto the path that He desires. The great I Am is the only sign that has been with us through thick and thin. When we get back, we will look back and we will say, the great I Am is with me, and we will worship God on this mountain. Amen. Amen.